Hello everyone, I'm Santiago and today I'm gonna be testing Mass Effect Legendary Edition on the ROG Ally. So before starting, I recommend you install some mods, so get the Mass Effect 3 Twix Mods Manager, there's a link for that in the description. And these are the mods I'm using, mostly community stuff and the ability to change the FOV. The FOV is a little bit too tight and you can skip the intro every time you launch the game, so I'll leave links for all these in the description, in a Google document maybe with all the links. So let's get right into the game. Keep in mind that you need an internet connection to launch the game, but if you disconnect the internet later, you can still play. The thing is, you need internet to launch the game even if you have it on Steam, like I do, due to the EA launcher. When it comes to the settings, we're basically on 1080p, the native resolution. We kept the frame rate to 120 since we have a VRR window and it's between 48 and 120, so no tearing. For the operating mode, we're using 25 watts plugged in. If we're unplugged, I'm using 20 watts. Going higher than this, especially in a game like this, makes no sense. Destroys the battery life, increases temperatures quite a bit, and at the same time, we get like 4 FPS more in the best case scenario. So keep it at 25 watts, at least when it's plugged in. And we are now into the game, full gamepad support, everything works as you would expect. And as you can see, there's drops into the 60s. You might say, oh man, that's bad for a game this old. And I agree, but they never changed the engine. We're still on Unreal Engine 3. So yeah, I think that they just couldn't do much for modern GPUs, especially using one core. But hey, we're inside the VRR window. We're at basically native resolution, so it's insanely sharp on the smaller screen, which I'm going to show you later. But in this specific area is when it runs the worst, at least for me. It can drop below 60 a couple times due to some of the effects that they decided to implement in here, such as the heavy depth of field, the amount of foliage. I wish it was more tweakable, but they went a bit overkill with the graphics on this engine for this. I mean, the game that got the most graphical upgrades is Mass Effect 1, definitely. So in small sections like this one, will probably drop into the 40s, but again, in the VRR window, we skipped the spoilers. Again, beautiful looking game, but this level just absolutely kills it. So what's my advice? If you are on a very demanding level, such as this one, drop it to 900p. And despite the resolution change, as you can see, it still drops frames. So again, it's a level issue, I'll call it. It's just how the game works in this location. Even dropping it to 30 watts, sorry, increasing the clocks to 30 watts, it still drops. Again, I think it's more of an issue of the game itself, unfortunately. Not much that you can do about it, even at 720p. Alright, so now I unplugged the charger and we have like 30 watts of usage from the battery. That includes the CPU, and every internal, including the screen. So you're basically getting 1 hour and 20 something minutes with the CPU at 20 watts. The other 10 watts are the rest of the system. So it runs well, but again, in demanding scenes, such as this scene that no matter how much we lower the resolution, we drop below 60. Again, game issue. Very specific. Otherwise, we're in the VRR window. And it looks super sharp. Again, we're playing at 1080p over here. 60 FPS most of the time. It rarely drops below 60. 20 watts, an hour and something, an hour and 20 maybe, a battery. Which is short, don't get me wrong, but it's a ROG Ally at the end of the day, so... For Mass Effect 2 we have less of an upgrade on the Legendary Edition. It's closer to the original when it comes to graphics. So 1080p, highest settings. Again, if you don't keep this resolution for some reason, it's stuck at 720p. Just restart the game. We locked it to 120 to stay within the VRR range. And let's continue. Unfortunately, I lost my save for Mass Effect 2, so while it runs a lot better than the first one, due to the lesser improvement in graphics, by the way, we're plugged in at 25 watts, the game should run worse outside of this facility. I'm dropping inside the Citadel, just like I told you about the first one. But on the Citadel, it's more of a single-threaded performance issue. Let's control this. And well, on 1080p, it stays above 60 basically all the time. It's more stable than Legendary Edition Mass Effect 1. And despite the effects on screen and some stutters the first time you launch the game, it's super fluid. And if you want a bit more battery life, in this case we're not testing the battery right now, you can actually improve the battery life by locking the frame rate to 60, which is an option inside the game as well. I don't think even there's a need to lower the resolution, because inside the Citadel, no matter the resolution, we're going to be CPU bound, because this game doesn't use multiple cores properly when it comes to high frame rate situations. So stick to 1080p, looks sharp AF, and you stay inside the VRR window super well. There's some stutters, but that's Unreal Engine 3 crap when loading different chunks of the level. And this is an example on one of those CPU limited areas. So we have stuff into the distance. We are into the 60s when we look at everything at the same time. But as soon as we zoom in, we jump into the 70s and 80s. Again, engine limitation. The GPU usage drops. No matter how much we lower the resolution, we cannot fix this. And it's going to happen on the Citadel when you are running around. But usually you're not in combat on the Citadel. So when you're in a situation like this, expect those drops, but it should be very short-lived, to say it in some way, and you're still inside the VRR window. So let's unplug the battery now. Unplug the charger and see what kind of frame rate we get. Alright, we're back. I unplugged the charger. Now we are at 18 watts, since this game is very similar to the original version. So we get a little bit more battery life, and we're at 28 watts, give or take, on the full usage of the system. If you lock it to 60, you should be using less power, so you can use that an FPS lock inside the game. Personally, I like staying on the VRR range, jumping from maybe 120 to... I mean, most of the time you'll be 80 to 120. Yeah, it looks super smooth most of the time. But again, if you're looking at an area that has lots of geometry into the distance, due to engine limitation, you won't use the entire GPU. So something like this will happen. You'll drop into maybe the upper 50s in the worst case scenario, but you cannot do anything about it because it's not fully utilizing the GPU, as you can see. If I zoom in and see less geometry, much higher frame rate, but the GPU usage increases. So it's just a thing with Unreal Engine 3, unfortunately. But again, should happen on the Citadel in very specific places. But you're still inside the VRR range, and we're talking about maybe 1 hour and a half of battery, maybe. Especially if you lock it to 60. So yeah, battery life on the ROG Ally is very disappointing. We're 18 watts on the APU, but keeping up with the rest of the system, which means the screen, the lights, all that, we're at 28, 29 watts. And here it's another area that's problematic with this engine, but it's finished loading. Maybe the transparency is over there. So again, don't lower the resolution, you're going to run into the same issues. I recommend sticking to 1080p so it looks insanely sharp on the smaller screen. And you should be good to go. So let's jump into Mass Effect 3. And finally, Mass Effect 3, my personal favorite in the franchise, despite the ending. Let's not talk about that. So again, same settings as before, 120 FPS cap to stay inside the VRR window. And we're at 25 watts since we're plugged in to the wall. So that's important.
Don't let it get close.
If you go any higher, it's really not a big difference. Oof. I almost died there. Alright, let's get away from here. So why did I choose this situation? Well, there's heavy combat, lots of explosions. The first time you're in this location, well, good luck. But again, I'm being super aggressive with it. As you can see, we're getting basically 60, maybe an average of 60 with some higher frame rates. There's a lot of enemies. This Atlas machine, when there's explosions, there's some smoke in the air, that destroys the frame rate, as you can see there. But the first time the game plays, this is the first time I launch it on the Ally, it has like stutters similar to the shader compilation in UE 5 and 4. And it also repeats the issue on the other games, as I told you, that if there is lots of geometry into the distance, I mean lots of geometry, more than usual geometry, is not going to fully utilize the GPU. But in this case, this is a game, if I wanted to stay closer to the 80 FPS range, drop it to 900p. But 1080p is completely fine in my opinion. Alright, welcome to the Citadel. This is one of those places where the engine just kills everything. Here, there is a good amount of characters, a good amount of draw distance, and we drop even into the 30s at times. Well, this also happened on the Steam Deck, that is a less powerful machine. We also had big drops like this ones. This is super specific, doesn't happen all the time. Happens on all the Mass Effect games in bigger parts of the Citadel. So as you can see, the GPU is fine, but then we'll look into the place with more geometry and blah, it absolutely dies. So this is the only part that I would say you cannot fix it lower in settings, unfortunately. Again, on the Steam Deck it also happens. Oh yeah, way better. So ignore what I said about the wattage, keep it on 20 watts. We used 2 more watts and we're still above an hour of battery, and it's way more consistent. So in this particular game, consider using 20 watts even if you're on battery life. If you're plugged in, 25 watts, way more stable. But on battery, to get more than an hour, at least 20 watts, I would say, is the way to go. But again, I'm nitpicking levels with multiple enemies to show you how good or bad it can get. How bad it can get, better said. So yeah, looking at geometry, whoops, it drops. Multiple enemies plus a big enemy that does a lot of smoke. That's also a drop in performance. But we are well inside the VRR range, which is what matters. Yeah, this is as bad as it gets, but as you can see, the GPU is at a nice 69% usage. It doesn't go to 100% because the game, I don't know, game engine stuff. So this is as bad as it can get, but luckily in these situations we are not in combat, so that's good. And as you can see, again, unplugged, around 30 watts, 30 something watts, whole system draw. The APU only 20 watts. Alright, so now some real life footage. I'm pointing a camera to the ROG Ally. I'm at 20 watts. I'm in the demanding part. We're outside of the VRR window when we drop it into this area and look at this specific angle. The APU is at 20 watts. The entire system draws like 30 watts. So an hour and 20 minutes of battery, give or take. Let's very quickly go,
Please select a destination.
yeah, to the docks. Again, this is the demanding part
Now arriving at
due to the amount of characters and geometry. Unreal Engine 3 is not fond of that. And we're on 1080p, So it looks razor sharp on the smaller screen. Here, this is another example of the Citadel being the Citadel. Not a GPU resolution issue, it's just a thing with the engine, unfortunately, and single-threaded performance. So CPU boost is super important here. Alright, so we're now in one of the most, at least in my opinion, fun moments of the game. It's a pretty nice combat encounter. Not going to spoil it, I'm just showing you. Not going to tell you why it happens. And as you can see, there is geometry mixed with a good amount of enemies. Maybe 3 or 4 are going to come right after these ones. But you stay inside the VRR range. So this is not as bad as the first level that I showed you. Despite being more geometrically complex, it's not Citadel levels of performance drops that Citadel drops into the 30s at times, which completely sucks. And as you can see, at 720 it stays closer to the 100 FPS mark, but it still drops into the 70s when we get explosions close to the camera. So this is why I still recommend 1080p, not only due to the sharpness, but because you're going to get over 100 most of the time, but when you're in stress points such as this one, you're going to have more inconsistency because it doesn't fully utilize the GPU, thanks Unreal Engine 3. If you don't care about going up and down from 100 to 80, then back to 100, 720p or 900p are good options, but 1080p is more GPU intensive, obviously. Looks way sharper because it's a higher resolution, but again, it usually stays into the 80s and drops into the 70s, so you're more consistently into that range. And when you get to the Citadel, oh man, you're going to drop from the hundreds of FPS you see here to 30 due to the, again, that limitation of the engine. Now I swap to 1080p, so the game is way sharper, and as you can see, instead of being into the hundreds of FPS when I look outside, it says 80, but it doesn't, it stays more consistently into the 80 FPS range. So we don't jump to 100, then to 80, then to 70. We stay very close to the limits of the GPU. So I think that's perfect for consistency. So yeah, 900p and 720p can let you higher frame rates, but when shit hits the fan, so to say, you're going to drop into very similar frame rates as you see on 1080p right now. Or my other advice is to lock it to 60 on 1080p, 900p or 720p. If you want to maximize battery life, lock it to 60 at 720p. But it's not like you're getting 3 hours of battery. You're going to stay below the 2-hour battery mark because it's still using a total system consumption of 30 watts. So the Mass Effect franchise on the ROG Ally, I'm pretty impressed with Mass Effect 2 and 3. Mass Effect 1, not super impressed because they pushed the graphics a little bit too hard for this older engine when increasing the graphics of Mass Effect 1. So multiple levels such as Eden Prime, one of the first ones, and all that, is going to drop below 60 like on the Citadel and Mass Effect 3, which is not ideal. Even if you lower the resolution, you cannot fix that. So on Mass Effect 2 and 3, I say is perfection. I wish it had more battery life, but you can be with BRR between 60 and 120 FPS, mostly into the 80s, excepting again on Mass Effect 1. But I think that 2 and 3 are awesome, especially due to the frame rate consistency. Being 80 to 100 FPS feels pretty damn good, even on the smaller screen, and the image is super sharp. So thank you again guys for watching. Hopefully EA removes the launcher in the middle between Steam and the game, so we can actually play fully offline. Because otherwise you need an internet connection to launch the game. After that you don't need to be online, but just the fact that launching the game requires internet freaking sucks in my opinion. So thank you for watching, and I'll see ya next time. Bye guys.